Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a really close, focused look at a massive turning point in modern history, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, look, we're not here to play partisan politics, right? Instead, we're diving straight into the direct source material. We're talking congressional reports, intelligence assessments, and insights from international diplomats, human rights groups, and, crucially, the first-hand accounts of Afghans themselves. Our goal? To map out the anatomy of a systematic failure. We're going to see exactly what went wrong, how critical voices worldwide say it should have been handled, and the rippling, devastating consequences of those decisions. So here's our roadmap for us today. We're going to cover the flawed Doha Agreement, a totally chaotic emergency evacuation, the betrayal of Afghan women, the resurgence of terror, and finally, a major shift in global power. Okay, just look at the sheer speed of this timeline. It's kind of staggering. For 20 years, the US and its NATO allies had this massive presence in Afghanistan, but the unraveling, that happened in essentially 18 months. From signing the Doha Agreement in February 2020 to suddenly abandoning Bagram Air Base in July 2021, and then Kabul falls on August 15th. These dates aren't just milestones on a calendar, they actually map out the cascading failure we're about to unpack. All right, part one, the flawed Doha Agreement, excluding the Afghan government. So what actually happened here? Well, it was a bilateral deal negotiated directly between the US and the Taliban. And get this, it completely excluded the elected Afghan government. Entirely. It even forced them to release 5,000 Taliban fighters straight back onto the battlefield. Now, on the flip side, critical politicians across the global spectrum, along with diplomats and NGOs, argue that any withdrawal absolutely should have been condition-based. To actually work, the strategy required inclusive intra-Afghan diplomacy, bringing local actors to the table to nail down a political settlement before pulling out. And the political fallout from that exclusion? Absolutely devastating. According to the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, or SAGAR, shutting out the Afghan government created this immediate perception that they were just a weak puppet state, completely abandoned by their main ally. Plus, by setting arbitrary withdrawal deadlines, the US basically threw away all its leverage. The Taliban realized they just had to wait it out. There was zero incentive for them to compromise. And forcing the release of those 5,000 prisoners, that completely destroyed the morale of the Afghan security forces. Basically, the diplomatic table was set for a total military collapse. Moving on to part two, a chaotic emergency evacuation, logistics of a disaster. When you dig into the source reports, they highlight three fatal operational missteps. First up, leadership ignored internal F-77 reports. In case you don't know, these are the critical documents that estimate exactly how many Americans are in a country and need evacuation planning. Second, they unilaterally abandoned Bagram Air Base in the dead of night. By doing that, the U.S. lost a highly secure secondary airfield that was absolutely vital for a safe exit. And third, they delayed ordering the official emergency evacuation, the NEO, until August 14th. That was literally hours before the Taliban entered Kabul. Military experts argue that prioritizing the political optics of the withdrawal over worst-case contingency planning practically guaranteed the chaos that followed. Because there was no secure secondary airfield and basically no early planning, you had these desperate crowds of thousands funneled entirely into Hamid Karzai International Airport. This created a highly vulnerable bottleneck, which tragically set the stage for a horrific ISIS-K suicide bombing at Abbey Gate. That attack took the lives of 13 U.S. service members and over 170 Afghan civilians. It was a completely avoidable tragedy born directly out of a lack of preparation. Section 3. The betrayal of Afghan women. 20 years of progress erased. For 2 decades, Western powers actively tied their military presence to the advancement and protection of women's rights. But today, Afghan activists and international human rights organizations are using a very stark term for the current reality: gender apartheid. The Taliban has completely institutionalized the oppression of women, systematically stripping them of education, employment, and honestly just the basic right to exist in public spaces. Listen to what one Afghan women's rights advocate had to say. She stated, "The process was not owned by Afghans, it was an international process." The sources clearly show how Afghan women felt entirely sidelined during those withdrawal negotiations. Human rights were basically treated by diplomats as temporary obligations rather than, core necessities. Female leaders, judges, and activists who had been promised protection by the West, they were suddenly just left totally alone to face targeted violence and forced isolation. Without any long-term structural accountability, 20 years of hard-won freedoms collapsed virtually overnight. I mean, women and older girls are now barred from school. They can't even travel with a male chaperone. Rural education initiatives that took literally years to build were dismantled instantly. And there are these harrowing accounts of female leaders having to burn their life's work, their degrees, their documents, just to avoid Taliban retribution. It's a profound generational betrayal.
Part 4. The Resurgence of Terror, a Growing Threat. The data coming out of intelligence and congressional reports right now is deeply alarming. Because the withdrawal wasn't tied to actual security conditions on the ground, a safe haven was basically handed right back to extremist organizations. Today, there are 27 violent extremist groups operating out of former NATO bases. Al-Qaeda has actually established 8 new training camps. ISIS-K is actively expanding its capabilities to plot attacks in the West. And the Haqqani Network, which is a designated terror organization, is literally governing alongside the Taliban. This reality completely shatters the diplomatic promises that were made. Think about it. The entire premise of the Doha Agreement was the Taliban's promise to sever ties with terror networks. Yet, in the summer of 2022, the leader of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was found living openly and comfortably in a villa right in downtown Kabul. It's undeniable proof that the Taliban totally broke their core promise, and the U.S. had essentially given up its presence based on a falsehood. And finally, Section 5. A shift in global power, fractured trust, and emboldened rivals.
The global fallout from all this resulted in deeply fractured trust. The U.S. completely failed to properly consult its NATO allies, many of whom, remember, had fought and bled in Afghanistan for 20 years. European leaders were reportedly blindsided by the sudden exit, which severely degraded America's credibility as a reliable partner. And on top of that, this projected weakness really emboldened adversaries. Foreign relations experts argue that the disorganized exit sent a massive signal of Western weakness. I mean, within months, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and China significantly cranked up its aggressive posturing in the Indo-Pacific.
But the damage isn't just playing out on the world stage. It's deeply personal back home, too. 73%. According to the reports, that is the percentage of Afghan war veterans who say they feel betrayed by how the war ended. The chaotic abandonment of local Afghan partners resulted in a massive moral injury for the troops who served there. In fact, it led to an 81% spike in calls to the Veterans Affairs Crisis Hotline in the year just following the withdrawal. A former military officer testifying before Congress really summed it up perfectly. He said, "When we left Afghanistan, we not only left behind allies, we left behind our honor." That quote right there perfectly encapsulates this profound sense of systemic abandonment. The military personnel who fought there, the NGO workers who spent decades building up civil society, they all feel that the absolute core principles of loyalty and duty were just discarded. Which leaves us with a final and honestly a vital question. If allies cannot trust the promises of the past, who will stand with us in the future? Look, when you exclude local governments, when you ignore the pleas of women fighting for their fundamental rights, and when you prioritize arbitrary deadlines over secure, condition-based planning, the cost is absolutely catastrophic. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this structured look at the source material has given you a much clearer understanding of the profound failures and the lasting impacts of the Afghan withdrawal. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.